Okay, I'd like to present our speaker tonight, Naomi Pequette. As most of you know, is a member of the Denver Astronomical Society and has been one of our youngest members and was one of the youngest members of the e-board, I think when she was 15 or 16, who knows. Naomi Pequette is a science communicator and astrophysicist. She is currently adjunct professor of astronomy at the University of Denver, an independent science education consultant, a new business that she has started. You'll have to see her website. Maybe she'll post that on the chat. Previously, Naomi worked at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, as most of you know, where she led an education program and content development for the Space Odyssey, which was an 8.9 million exhibition redesign, as well as pioneered a new era of live programs in Gates Planetarium. She is also co-author of a new book, The Science of Sci-Fi Cinema, which hits the bookshelves this fall. And that's the same title of her presentation tonight, is The Science of Sci-Fi. So have fun.
All right. I just want to remind people that we will take questions. Go ahead and put them in the chat, and then we'll ask you to state them yourself after Naomi's presentation. Sorry, Naomi, for the interruption. Go ahead.
No worries at all. Is everyone hearing me okay? Give a thumbs up. Perfect. All right. So thank you all for having me. As July said, my name is Naomi. I have been a Denver Astronomical Society member for more than half my life. So happy to be coming back. And for about as long as I have loved science, I've also loved science fiction. And so it was really exciting in college. I got to take some classes that explored this idea of the relationship between science and science fiction, how they can support one another, inspire one another, to keep pushing boundaries. And so when I worked at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, I was really excited to be able to use not only my background in physics and astrophysics, but to take that interest of science fiction forward. And we'll talk a little bit about how we use that in the new redesign of our Space Odyssey exhibition, which opened last year in November. But I also got to participate in a really special series of events called the Sci-Fi Film Series. This was a partnership with Metropolitan State University of Denver, as well as the Denver Film Society. And this was a really exciting opportunity for us because we found that folks who were more interested in film came to learn about the science of these films. And the folks that were there for the science got to learn a bit about art and production. And so it really broadened everyone's interests and knowledge base. And so for the 10-year plus one, thanks COVID, celebration of the Sci-Fi Film Series, a series of scientists, including myself, as well as Dr. Vincent Paturo, who is a professor of film and media studies, collaborated to release our brand new book, The Science of Sci-Fi Cinema, which came out this month. So we're really excited about it. And I actually have a physical copy, which is super exciting to be able to have. So I wanted to explore some of these topics of science and science fiction and their relationship together. So the first thing to get out of the way is the difference between science fiction and fantasy. Now, in bookstores, these two are shelved together, but for the purposes of our discussion, they are very, very different. Right? So science fiction deals with scenarios in technology that are possible based on our science, right? So these might be really far future space operas or time travel stories that might seem implausible, but they at least have a small toe in science. And sometimes, yes, they do ignore inconvenient bits of science that might undermine their stories. I'm looking at you, Martian, and your windstorm that you started with, but still, there is some tie to technology and to science. On the other hand, fantasy deals with the supernatural and magical occurrences that really don't have a basis in science. We see witches, werewolves, vampires, there are magical powers, supernatural creatures, and they generally are set in a supernatural realm, not based in Earth, although sometimes like superhero movies, you do see them based in Earth as well. So we're going to be focusing on that science fiction side. So kind of have to unjumble them from our brains. Now, one of the things that we know is that science can inspire science fiction, right? We talked about The Martian. And despite its windstorm, it is heavily inspired by science. And I wanted to share a couple of my favorite examples where the science fiction got the science right, and it really was the basis for their story. So one of the most obvious ones from recent history is Interstellar, the movie. It was praised for its scientific accuracy when it was released, and for good reason. The director, Christopher Nolan, really wanted to ensure that Interstellar adhered as closely as possible to the real science. So he hired Caltech theoretical physicist Kip Thorne as both an executive producer, and a science consultant for the movie. Now, Thorne worked closely with the visual effects team to nail the look of the film's black hole Gargantua, which you can see in this image here, their visualization. And so they used brand new CGI techniques and rendering software but they still based it on these theoretical equations that Thorne provided. And in fact, they actually revolutionized the way we can visualize black holes. And because they wanted to create such a smooth image and a cohesive sense of movement around this black hole, they actually produced visualizations better than what we could do with theoretical models and supercomputers. And so it actually allowed Thorne to discover information about gravitational lensing and these accretion disks surrounding black holes. And they published a paper together, Kip Thorne and the visual effects team. So while science was inspiring this movie, a little bit of science was inspired as well. And boy, did they get it right. Now, by now, you've probably seen the famous image of the black hole at the center of M87 that was released in 2019. This particular version on the left is from 2021, so just this year, which is in polarized light. And so this black hole is billions of times more massive than our sun. It's about 50 million light years away in the elliptical galaxy M87. And this fuzzy kind of glowing halo was the first time that we got to really verify with a direct image our theoretical predictions of black holes. There have been other lines of evidence before this, but this image was the smoking gun. And when we look at it in polarized light, that fuzzy ring now appears a little bit more in focus. You see some of these lines coming in into what seems like that bottomless pit, right? And what we're seeing is the magnetic field lines on the inner edge of that accretion disk of the black hole. So one of the questions we asked, what could we do with it if it wasn't blurry, right? So on the right, you see a computer visualization that NASA produced based on information from this image. And boy, does it look like Gargantua, right? They really did get it right in that science fiction movie. And you'll see it rotate here in just a short bit to show us another perspective, which is what we are viewing that black hole from. So it's really not surprising, given the amount of work the filmmakers and the visual effects team put in to get it right for this science fiction movie. And they really were basing their entire plot on as accurate science as you can until you get to the end and Matthew McConaughey does some weird things with books, but we're going to ignore that. Another great example is from Contact, which makes sense, right? This was a novel written by Carl Sagan that was then turned into a movie. And this really explores what is alien contact? What might it look like, right? And so when you have a scientist at the helm of this novel, you're going to get some accurate science. And it is no secret that Dr. Eleanor Arroway, our protagonist, and SETI scientist, or Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence scientist, was largely based on the real-life scientist, Dr. Jill Tarter. But the signal itself is really based in what we think a good signal from aliens might look like, or frankly, what we send out there to a certain extent. Again, this makes sense. Carl Sagan was deeply involved with the Voyager record and the Pioneer message, and was good friends with Dr. Frank Drake, who sent out the Arecibo message as well, which was our radio signal out to the universe saying, hey, we're here and here's a bit about us. So in the movie, the signal is detected by radio telescopes. This is indeed how we are listening for other signals from extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, the Very Large Array, not the ideal choice for this, but we're going to forgive them because it was so very pretty and picturesque in that view. Now, the first clue that the signal is not of natural origin was the frequency they sent it at. And so they say in the movie, it is called hydrogen times pi. So hydrogen, the 21 centimeter line in radio astronomy, is a very prevalent line that we see emitted by hydrogen gas in our galaxy and beyond. And by multiplying it by pi, this was a frequency we knew could not be occurring naturally. So really good smoking gun detector that this is not some other natural phenomenon. And it gives us insights into how advanced that civilization is. Not only do they have the astronomy to know enough that there is this big prevalent 21 centimeter line, but they are mathematically advanced enough to understand the concept of pi and then utilize that to send out their radio signal. The second clue was its strength. So in the movie, we hear that the strength was 100 Janskys. A Jansky is a unit used by radio astronomers to describe the brightness or strength of a signal. And typically celestial radio signals are a few Janskys in strength. So when I was studying M82, for example, and looking for very, very strong radio signals coming from M82, I had signals of a few millijanskys, to give you an idea. Even our sun at its peak output puts out a signal of 108 Janskys, right? So this is the big booming signal saying, deliberately sent out saying, find me. And then there is the fact that when they initially detect it, it is sent in a series of pulses of prime numbers, right? Again, speaking to that mathematical ability of that civilization. These are all clues we would die for as astronomers to find in a signal, just really obvious, hit us over the head, hence that this is not a natural signal. And then when you get to the message itself, it is a layered and much more complex image, which makes sense. You want, as a civilization, sending out a radio signal, right, to pack as much information into it as you can. And so they used a series of dots to establish basic mathematics, which we also did with binary numbers and the Arecibo message. And then there was even more complex three-dimensional engineering scheme to build a spacecraft. Wouldn't that be cool? And in Hollywood time, you can decode this in just a few months and build these ships, when in reality, this would probably take us decades to be able to solve. In fact, that Arecibo message here is what it looks like. Dr. Frank Drake sent this out to Carl Sagan and some other colleagues, and they spent a couple months and they didn't even decode all of it. So best of luck. And I should mention, I really love Contact. This was an inspirational movie to me, seeing Dr. Eleanor Arway, and that is my chapter in the book. It's called The Sounds of Contact. And, you know, I will tell you where you can get the book in a bit, but also this article was published in Engadget as well. So if you want to check it out and don't want to buy the book, I'm not deeply offended. You can read it in Engadget. Okay, so we've seen examples of this. As scientists, we look for the science in sci-fi, right? But can science fiction do the opposite and inspire science? And my argument is absolutely yes, it can. So let's look at some anecdotal evidence, right? When the Martian movie came out, it became a pop culture sensation. And as I worked at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, we saw a lot of increase in questions from our audiences and our guests saying, can you really grow poop potatoes on Mars? And so this actually caused me to do a lot of research, and I went into a deep dive, discovering what the composition of the Martian regolith is, and discovered these pesky things called perchlorates, which are groundwater contaminants here on Earth that are, you know, thousands of times more prevalent on Mars, and read papers from the 1800s about perchlorate uptakes into different plants. You don't really need to know all of that, nor did our guests, but fun story. I had a nerd moment on my first date with my now fiance, and he now tells me that I had him at perchlorates. So pretty sure that's going into our wedding vows. So not science there, but a little bit of personal fun. But regardless, we did see this increased interest from our guests wanting to understand the real science behind it. And when there was a satellite launched with simulant Martian regolith that was indeed growing potatoes, we had a lot of guests wanting to know more. I mean, and you can even argue our Astronaut on the Surface show, which is a show we do twice daily. We have a Mars diorama that is based on a real location on Mars, Candor Chasma, part of Valles Marineris. is a sort of science fiction show. We're pretending we're in the year 2044. Now, we heavily base this on NASA mission plans and contemporary science, like all that perchlorate research I did because they paid me and it was fun. But we see this idea of this scenario that we put our guests into of being in the future actually inspires really great scientific questions and curiosities about contemporary missions. Okay, that's really anecdotal. Science, we like data. Let's look at some specific data of how this was inspired. So we can start much, much earlier than The Martian, right? We can look back to Jules Verne, who is considered the father of science fiction. He wrote over 50 novels and essays during his lifetime, including the famous Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and more. In 1865, he even predicted travel to the moon in a cannon-like device from Earth to the moon, which isn't perfect, but doesn't seem nearly as far-fetched now as it did then, right? We've got these rocket technologies. Now, while Jules Verne is probably most famous for his fictional submarine, the Nautilus, the French author also envisioned the future of flight. And Igor Sikorsky, who was the inventor of the modern helicopter, was inspired by Verne's book, Clipper to the Clouds, which he read as a young boy. And he often quoted Jules Verne, cited him as his inspiration, and often said, loved Jules Verne's quote, "Anything that one man can imagine, another man can make real." And that was definitely the case here. Now, Robert H. Goddard, who is the American scientist who built the first liquid-fueled rocket, which successfully launched in 1926, became fascinated with spaceflight after reading an 1898 newspaper serialization of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. And shortly thereafter, he recounted he actually dreamed of constructing a workable spaceflight machine. So in his diary on October 9th, 1899, he recounts that he climbed a cherry tree in his backyard and imagined how wonderful it would be to make some device which even had the possibility of ascending to Mars. "When I descended the tree," he wrote, "existence at last seemed to have purpose." And he is today considered the father of modern rocketry. And much of his work, while ignored by the US government until after World War II, was also used by Wernher von Braun. And so we can directly tie that to War of the Worlds. Now, despite his tongue-in-cheek claims, William Shatner is not personally responsible for changing the world or inspiring a new slew of science and technology inventions. But Star Trek is a huge inspiration. And I'm seeing I froze, so I apologize if I am frozen on your screen here, or if I'm good. Hopefully you can still hear me. So science fiction definitely, Star Trek definitely is an inspiration. And so one of the most famous gadgets from the show was the communicator. Audio is good, perfect. All right, I'm gonna turn off my camera and turn it back on. My apologies for it being slow here. But one of the most famous gadgets from the show was that communicator, a device that worked a lot like what we know a wireless phone works like today. And Martin Cooper, the director of research and development for Motorola, credited Star Trek as partial inspiration for a lot of his designs. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get that camera back on. And so when he actually released that first mobile phone, the Dynatech, it didn't look a lot like the communicator, but it had very similar functions. And he said, it was quoted as saying, "That was not fantasy for us. That was an objective." And so that was something that he really strived to. And when he released the Motorola StarTAC, it was directly inspired by the look and feel of the Star Trek communicator. And even now that flip phone look is coming back. I just saw a brand new one in Best Buy that is looking oddly like the communicator with a giant touch screen. All right, I'm going to pause for just a second. I apologize. My camera is just doing something really quite bizarre here. So I'm trying to get that back up and running for you. I'll stop my video in the meantime so we can keep going. And so we also see inspiration in software. The Star Trek episode A Matter of Time, which was season 5 of Star Trek The Next Generation, We see data trying to listen to 4 pieces of music simultaneously on a computer. And Apple scientist Steve Perlman said he got the idea for the groundbreaking multimedia program Quicktime after watching that specific episode of Star Trek. And then it was his inspiration to try and figure out how in the world could we actually listen to music on our computer. Now, you could also theoretically credit Star Trek with the popularization and the idea of an easy-to-use personal computer with the original series and even the tablet. But those are a smidge harder for us to provide direct correlation to. And we also know that Star Trek inspired individuals to pursue careers in STEM. Retired astronaut Dr. Mae Jemison often talks about how Star Trek was a source of inspiration for her, and in particular, actress Nichelle Nichols and her character Lieutenant Uhura. And now Dr. Jemison did go on to become the first African-American woman to travel to space, and NASA astronauts are not allowed to make appearances on TV shows, but after she retired from the astronaut corps, she did appear in a speaking role as an engineer on Star Trek: The Next Generation. You've also had other speakers, Dr. Aaron McDonald, who was your speaker in October of 2020 for the Denver Astronomical Society, was also heavily inspired by Star Trek and went on to become the science advisor for Star Trek and an expert in that darn warp drive that Ron was mentioning earlier and wanting that for the Voyager spacecraft. Now, another interesting one that pops up is actually the X-Files, which you can argue how much this is science fiction and how it blurs the line to fantasy, right? But 50 years of social science research has revealed that the characters, images, and storylines in media shape our everyday lives in profound ways. And so Dr. Dana Scully, for those of you not familiar with X-Files, was one of the protagonists on this TV show. She was an FBI special agent and a medical doctor and had a background in hard science. And she was placed on the X-Files unit to monitor and debunk Fox Mulder's work on unsolved crimes that he claimed were caused by paranormal events. And so she was supposed to be using her scientific expertise. Now, at the time that Scully showed up in 1993 on television, we didn't see that type of female represented much at all in our world of television. And so we had anecdotal evidence that this was something that was really important to women, that they had been inspired by her. But there was actually a 2018 study by the Gina Davis Institute that had examined just how much the character of Dana Scully influenced girls and women to focus on STEM. And so they surveyed 2,021 participants of women who were over the age of 25. Nearly 2/3 of these women, 63%, who were familiar with Dana Scully, said she increased their belief of the importance in STEM. And 50% of those same women say Scully increased their interest in STEM. More specifically, though, Scully's influenced medium to heavy women viewers of the X-Files to consider working in a STEM field, it was 43% of them, actually study a STEM field, 27%, and to work in a STEM field, 24%. Now, it is hard to draw a direct line of causation there. Women who are interested in science might just be more inclined to watch a sci-fi show like the X-Files than women who grow up to be, say, historians. But viewers also tended to say that Scully gave them a positive impression of women in science. More than half of the respondents who were familiar with Scully's character said she increased their confidence in succeeding in a male-dominated profession. And more than 60% of the respondents said she increased their belief of the importance of STEM. And when they were asked to describe her, they were most likely to say she was smart and intelligent before any other adjective, which was unheard of in women television characters. So when children start implicitly pairing men and math and science as early as age 7, which is a bias that lasts to adulthood, positive representations of women in STEM, like Dana Scully, like even Nyota Uhura, are increasingly important. And this was just such an interesting study and something that is widely discussed now. Now, having felt the impact of science fiction myself as well as the ways it could engage guests at DMNS, I've actually started using science fiction in my own classroom at the University of Denver. I teach space sciences for non-science majors, so I'm teaching descriptive astronomy this quarter. And so the way I use this is to actually ask them to apply knowledge from the class of hard science to a science fiction scenario. So, for instance, verifying the windstorm on Mars, could that be a real scenario? The latest one we had them do was looking at the moon of Endor, which is this forested moon of cute Ewoks, right? That is around a gas giant. As we learned about gas giants, I asked them to take data from our solar system and see if that could really exist. And I'm also really not afraid to make science fiction references in class, from the Millennium Falcon dodging asteroids to astronomers as time travelers and throwing up a Back to the Future image. I found that making this content relatable to something in their normal experiences, like pop culture, is making them more engaged. Now, it's also true of hockey. I got a lot of sports players really excited when I taught them Newton's laws of motion with hockey, but we've mainly been using some of this science fiction. And I'm so sorry, my camera just completely died on me, of course. I'm so sorry about that. So I wanted to conclude by looking at what we did at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science with our all new Space Odyssey exhibition, and particularly our fantasy spaceship. Now, before we opened Space Odyssey, we did a lot of audience research to find out what they wanted our guests wanted from a space science exhibit. But we also went to our industry partners in aerospace and in STEM to find out what they wanted from a space science exhibit and what inspired them. And so we found that all of our partners were concerned about the STEM pipeline, this idea that we're not producing enough workers to go into future STEM fields. And so we asked them what inspired them. And about half of them cited science fiction, and a lot of them Star Trek in particular as their inspiration to pursue STEM, because they saw futuristic technologies on the screen and they read about them in books, and they wanted to be able to go into a career that could make them a reality. So how might we make a cell phone make warp drive? So with the help of their input, we designed the fantasy spaceship. It is grounded in science, but it goes beyond what we are capable of today. So we're going to take a look at some photos of that fantasy spaceship for those of you that aren't fortunate enough to have gone to the exhibit yet. So you enter our spaceship first by traveling through space. This is what we call our sensory spacewalk. It is something like 21 miles or something insane of fiber optic cables, in a very, very dark environment, in a very soundproofed environment that is meant to give you the feel of being in space, being slightly disoriented, having that quiet around you. And then you step forward and you see our first view of the fantasy spaceship. And you also start to hear some of these sounds to put you in that idea that you are somewhere else. You are no longer at the museum. You are now journeying to the future in another spaceship. So you can actually go through several different experiences. My favorite is our view screen. We worked closely with our design firm Roto to develop a whole series of different spacescapes that are slightly fantasy-esque, that you can drive our fantasy spaceship through them. You do experience a real delay in acceleration and deceleration because we used physics as our basis. There's a huge captain's wheel you can turn and slowly move the ship around. And then if you accelerate it to the speed of light, you can jump to light speed and you get this effect that you're seeing here, and you end up in another mural and somewhere else in space. And of course, this is a great way to engage the whole family. Someone has to be controlling the thrusters. Someone's got to be controlling the wheel to turn you around. And of course, you've got to have a captain's chair on the bridge of a fantasy spaceship, right? We also have these interesting ribs throughout our hallways. That was an interesting design choice of trying to make this spaceship feel slightly more organic. But in between them are these different touch panels with different symbols on them. And you can find hidden symbols all throughout the exhibit. And if you put them together in the right combination, you can change the lights in our corridor, but you also get announcements. There's about 20 different announcements. Anything from telling you you've arrived at a planet that has no Wi-Fi to it, to telling you a decontamination process is in place, which was done pre-COVID. We didn't think about that message. And even like an alien language we semi-developed pops up through this.
Greetings, Earthlings. Welcome to Kepler 61. Unfortunately, there is no Wi-Fi on Kepler 61. You probably want to keep it moving. Saludos terrícolas. Bienvenidos a Kepler 61. Desafortunadamente, no hay Wi-Fi en Kepler 61. Probablemente quieras seguir adelante.
So our whole exhibit is bilingual English and Spanish, including those audio announcements, even from aliens. So next up is just a cute little video. It's going to show you some of the experiences with some kids in action here. And so you start here at the view screen, that jump to light speed. And then this is our laser cannon. And so people can fire that laser cannon by using teamwork and a series of pushes. And then our computer core asked you to solve different puzzles to eventually win a dance party. But you have to work together to solve a whole bunch of puzzles. So a lot of this is about using those STEM skills of problem solving, of looking for clues, of trying to find all these different puzzles and things in there, and then inspiring them to think about what might be through that idea of jump to light speed, but also that ship's a little bigger than it appears. You can see yourself in a multiverse. And if you're lucky enough to encounter a volunteer nearby, they might just tell you some real cosmology about the multiverse. So I see this really lovely connection between science and science fiction. It's something that's inspired me. It's something that's inspired other scientists. And, you know, it's something, frankly, that is just a fun thing to contemplate. So with that, I will give you this shameless self-plug, as Ron Rannick would say, that you can pick up our book starting this month at a lot of places. If you like to shop local, I encourage you to go to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science Museum Shop, both online and in person. But it is available in physical and digital versions from Barnes & Noble and Amazon online, Apple Books, Google Play, and you can order it directly from our publisher, McFarland. And with that, I would love to open it up to questions. Again, I am so sorry about my camera. I do not know what's happened. I've unplugged and plugged everything back in, but I would love to answer your questions.
Hi, Naomi. Yes, if you want to end screen sharing, we'll see if we can get you back.
Yes. Let me try one more thing here.
That is a beautiful picture.
That was taken in our Mars diorama at the museum. It's one of my favorite photos. We were able to get in there.
Nice, nice.
So let me try and get that going here.
Well, you've already answered my question, which was where could we get your book? So I'm grateful for that. And
all right. Happy to take another question while I work on my video here.
Okay. I don't see any others. Ed remarked that he's reminded of the Qualcomm Tricorder X Prize, which that's pretty cool. He also asked, what classic hard sci-fi book that hasn't been made do you think should be made?
Ooh, it's going back into.
Oh, into a movie.
Into a movie, yeah.
Into a movie, yes.
Yeah. You know, I am a huge fan of Ben Bova's Mars. It is one that, as I was reading it, I was really skeptical about the science of it, and then just blew my mind at the end. I think there's just some really beautiful scenery described on Mars that we've backed up with images now. I'm also a huge fan of Neil Stephenson, but his books tend to get really complicated. So I'm sure we'd have a Lord of the Rings style, like 4-hour movie with any of those. I see. Oh, Fantastic Voyage. Oh, that would be good too. All right. I see Digby's got his hand up too.
Yes, go ahead with your question, Digby. Digby, you're muted right now. If you can unmute, go ahead with your question when you unmute. There you go. Oh, Digby, we're not hearing you. I don't know if your microphone is connected. If you can't turn on your microphone, maybe you can put your question in the chat. And Ron, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Naomi, I seem to recall reading somewhere, maybe Astronomy or Sky and Telescope, that the Hollywood version of the black hole, which was incredibly authentic, as you described, did have one part that didn't quite match what the physicists wanted, but Hollywood said, well, we want it this way. And that was that the top of the black hole was supposed to be, in reality, a little dimmer than the bottom half. And if you look at the image from the movie, it's equal brightness. Do you remember anything about that?
Oh, I do vaguely remember that. Sorry, switching cameras entirely here. I do vaguely remember that because they were looking at the idea of gravitational lensing around some of these black holes. So it actually, if you look at the image of the black hole itself, you'll notice of M87 that some areas are brighter because it's actually lensed more light from a different part of the black hole. And I think it had to do with that. But that's something I'd have to dig back into to see what we were doing there.
Wonderful. We're happy to see you there. Steve Barr, would you like to ask Naomi your question?
Yes. Where did the original concept for warp drive come from? Was it based on science or science fiction?
That's a great question. Science or science fiction there. So warp drive is a science fiction idea, right? And so you can look at how we actually can achieve warp drive on various science fiction shows changes a little bit, but there is a tiny bit of science there. The idea of wormholes is what some people use. You basically punch a hole in space-time, or you are somehow folding space and time so that it is smaller in front of you, larger behind, just kind of that Star Trek idea. So it's an interesting intermingle because general relativity was around. So I can't say for sure how much that truly inspired people, but the study of warp drive today, and can we make that happen? That's 100% inspired by science fiction using real science that we have today. And that is something, if you're interested in learning about warp drive, I cannot plug my friend, Dr. Erin McDonald, enough. She is absolutely fabulous. She is the world's most expert on warp drives because she tells Star Trek what is accurate and what is not to go in there. And it's just super fun. You can follow her on a lot of different platforms, YouTube. She does Dr. Erin Explains the Universe and a bunch of fun stuff. So definitely check her out.
Thank you, Naomi. Richard Ottolini, I see you made a post in the chat. Do you have a question for Naomi? Okay. And by the way, Dave Spillman, can you mute yourself, please? We keep hearing sound from you. Thank you.
Oh, now I want to know the answer to Ron's trivia question he just posted in the chat. Which TV show or movie first used the phrase light speed? I don't know this one.
Is Ed, was that your guess? Galaxy Quest?
It's got to be earlier than that, right? Snark, yeah. But Galaxy Quest is fabulous. It is a fantastic sci-fi movie and really fun.
So what's the answer, Ron?
Forbidden Planet.
Oh, Yeah, that is such a great sci-fi movie and the home of so many things that we think of as sci-fi tropes now, right? Started with Forbidden Planet. That is a fabulous classic sci-fi movie. One of my favorite movies or favorite sci-fi movies, and one of my favorite memories was going to see that at Alamo Drafthouse when they screened it on a large screen with Tim Havens, who I think is in here, and a crew from SNS Aptica. That was a lot of fun.
Good. Okay, I noticed that Digby Kirby still had his hand up. Digby, do you have a microphone now? Okay. I'm not seeing anything in the chat from him. Anybody else with questions or brief comments? All right. Well, hearing nothing and seeing nothing, we'll wrap up your presentation, Naomi. Thank you so very. Oh, I see a hand up at the last second. Zach and July, which one of you has a question? Go ahead. Zach or July, we can't hear you.
You're still muted.
There you go. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
There we go. All right.
I knew it had to be Zach.
Thanks. So, there's sort of a practical limit to some of this stuff because sure, we can go at warp speed, quote unquote, the speed of light. We can argue if we can cross it, but let's say we get close to it without going bust. Still, if you figure out comfortable gravity for the average human and you figure out what 1G acceleration works out to over time, I figured out back of the envelope a long time ago, it pretty much take you about a year to get close to the speed of light, other physics notwithstanding, a straight acceleration to get up to, to C. And then realistically, if we wanted to go to a nearby star system, let's say 4.5 light years away, that's not a 4.5 year trip because it's going to take you a year to accelerate to that speed. And when you get there, a year to decelerate, and that's got to be worked out unless you want to be living at 2Gs all the time, or 3Gs, in which case be sure I'm going, right? So what are your feelings on this practical reality that Captain Kirk can't just say, or anybody else in any other sci-fi flick can't really just say, let's go warp 6 or warp 1 or whatever, because they get squashed flat, and that necessary compromise. What do you think of all that?
So kind of twofold there. One is, so with Captain Kirk, with Star Trek, right, we are not really accelerating through space and time in the same way, right? We are actually collapsing space-time in front of us and expanding it behind, which is kind of pushing you almost on a wave of space-time through, which has other implications. We won't go there. And so you wouldn't have that same level of acceleration. Also, hand wavy space, future technologies, why can't we balance that out, right?
Yeah.
Another way sci-fi gets around this a lot of times is putting folks in cryogenic sleep, that they just, even 4 years is a long time to be able to have enough water and food and supplies for a crew, right? Yep. And so by putting them in these cryogenic sleeps, which we can't do yet, right? So hand wavy tech, but they avoid some of these effects. So a little bit of sci-fi magic that maybe something can be made possible.
Right. Yep.
Good.
Same, it would be true though, even just with changing your course ever so slightly, like, we actually goofed up, we need to be 2 degrees to the left. Whoops, that's already significant at those speeds.
Very much so, very significant. Yeah. No fast course corrections. That's for sure.
So I got a comment from Digby. He said, really good presentation, Naomi. A joy to see where you are in your career. So for those in the club who don't know about your recent change, you want to tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, so I just joined the University of Denver. I'm an adjunct professor of astronomy there. So I'm teaching all their 1,000 level astronomy courses, which are kind of aimed at non-science majors. So we've got descriptive astronomy that we're halfway through this quarter, and then be teaching solar system astronomy and stars and cosmology, all conceptual based, all using a free textbook, which I think is really fun that we have an open source textbook. And then I'm also started my own consulting business. I'm doing science education consulting. So presentations where a camera works all the time. So sorry. In person and digitally, I've got my own virtual studio set up. I'm working to set up in the basement to do pre-recorded stuff. And also hoping to continue to partner with news channels to bring some of the current space science news out there. So if you know anyone looking for a science educator for hire, you've got a freelancer in your corner that would be happy to jump in.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Oh, that's great. Well, we'll keep that all in mind. Did you get to meet Dean Regas when he was here?
I didn't. I actually had something else going that night, which killed me because I would have loved to meet him and see what software he was using, because I was curious. I'm using OpenSpace, which is a free planetarium software that our community has been working on for a while in the planetarium community. And so I'm using that with classes and with outreach. And so I was kind of curious to compare notes with him. I'll have to reach out.
Right. Ed has a comment, which is accurate. I think you know this. Ron Rannick has an in with all of the TV stations weather people. So
very true. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you need to get some introductions there.
Yeah. I did it a lot through the museum, and now on my own, it's a little different.
I bet. Okay. Well, I think we are out of questions. So thank you so much, everybody. Please join me in applauding Naomi. We are so grateful to have you here.
Yeah, so grateful to be here. Thank you all again so much. And final apologies on that. My camera has fully died. So, but glad the audio came through and could still share this with you.
Yes, no worries. Thank you so much.